There are nebulous thresholds along the Appalachian Trail where the paper map in your hands will suddenly render itself entirely obsolete. The cartographic scale dissolves into meaninglessness. The contour lines tangle and vanish entirely before the tree line even truly closes in. I always prefer to begin with that thought, because once you cross over that boundary, a frontier far beyond the reach of human comprehension, you are no longer the observer, you become the observed. Every unseen entity lurking beneath that dark primordial moss is counting your every breath, possessing the infinite patience of 10,000 years just to wait for a single misstep. Tonight we shall reopen the dossier on Oza's Thorn Castle, a legend among the Forestry Service, a pitiable victim of supernatural forces operating far beyond our understanding. Or, at the very least, that is, his crumpled 41-page journal as desperately wanted the world to believe. The tale you are about to hear, a flawless theatrical production, an immaculate facade, sculpted from the clay of pure, unadulterated terror. Yet, the truth buried deep beneath that veneer assumes a shape far more ruthless and blood-soaked than any piece of local folklore. But before the suffocating shadows of the Pisgah forest swallow us whole tonight, I need you to do me a small favor. Tell me down in the comments, from which county are you listening to this? Which city? Do not merely give me the state. I want to know the exact jurisdiction of the mailbox where you reside. Knowing exactly how far these whispers are slithering into the night is of utmost importance to me. Because the deeper I delve into the pitch-black recesses of the human psyche, the more I realize one indisputable truth: dark secrets never lose their way. They always know their final destination in advance, and they know exactly how to knock on the right doors of the guilty. Now, lock your doors tight. The wind from the valley is already howling. The man I am telling you about was not the radiant quintessential hero so frequently plastered across television screens. If you are conjuring the image of a park ranger with a chiseled, square jaw, donning a crisply ironed uniform, standing tall and defiant in polished leather boots against a pack of grizzlies, you are sorely mistaken. Oza's Thorn Castle was a diminutive man. His shoulders were gaunt and perpetually hunched, as if forever bearing the invisible, crushing weight of the high-altitude frost. Yet he possessed the thick, calloused, brutish wrists of a laborer intimately acquainted with pickaxes and heavy rope. When he finally drew his last, rattling breath in the autumn of 1958, at the age of 57, he was nothing more than a hollowed-out shadow, convulsing upon a miserable rented bed in Asheville, North Carolina. In the twilight of his life, as a mysterious affliction was ruthlessly devouring his innards and causing his hands to tremble so violently that the pen would repeatedly fly from his grasp, Oza's made the decision to write. He wrote with an agonizing slowness, clutching a dulled pencil stub, pressing the lead into the backs of thick yellowed supply requisition forms he had smuggled out when he fled the Forestry Service 14 years prior. He wrote during the bleakest, most lightless hours of the early dawn, while his wife Marigold still slumbered deeply in the room above. Every so often, his hand would spasm with such vicious force that the graphic would skid, tearing the paper's flesh, forcing him to wipe the cold, clammy sweat from his saturated palms onto a nearby handkerchief before he could painstakingly resume. Those pages chronicled what actually transpired on the night of October 17, 1938. When the ordeal commenced, Oza's was 37 years old. He was no cowardly greenhorn rookie, easily spooked by his own shadow. He was a hardened man who had memorized every inch of a 14-mile stretch of trail, slicing through the very core of the Pisgah National Forest. A treacherous, unforgiving domain the locals colloquially dubbed the Cradle, due to the way the mountain ridges folded in upon themselves in 3 deep, plunging layers, exactly like a pair of giant hands cupping rainwater. Oza's had traversed that cradle under the most punishing, apocalyptic weather conditions imaginable. Those very hands, with their oversized, protruding knuckles, had hauled the purpled, frozen stiff corpses of 2 hikers who had slipped and plummeted to the icy bottom of a ravine. Those exact hands had wielded a borrowed shovel to dig a grave for a horse with a shattered leg in the middle of a desolate meadow, coating himself in its blood from head to toe. Oza's Thorn Castle had spent more nights in absolute isolation deep within the ancient woods than a normal man spends alone in an entire lifetime. He held no belief in ghosts or demons. His faith lay strictly in the biting cold, the gnawing hunger, and the merciless, unyielding laws of the natural world. Situated at the exact midpoint of that 14-mile trek was a ranger's service cabin, erected in 1926. The structure was minuscule and dilapidated, crowned with a rusted tin roof that, whenever a torrential downpour struck, beat out a deafening, skull-splitting rhythm resembling the frantic drumming of a lunatic. Its cast-iron stove perpetually choked and vomited smoke back into the room whenever the winds swept from the east. The cabin possessed but a single, square window, casting a bleak, clouded gaze toward the west, overlooking a creek that remained entirely unmarked on any cartographic record. The rangers referred to it as Whisper Creek, christened for the uncanny, murmuring, almost mournful sound the water produced as it threaded through dense layers of dead, decaying leaves when the water levels ran low in autumn. Ozas cherished that cabin. He once confessed in a surviving letter to his brother that this claustrophobic space, reeking of rotting timber and acrid smoke, was the solitary place on this earth where he felt he was exactly the right size. Neither grand nor pitifully insignificant, merely a man-shaped entity huddled within a man-shaped room, enveloped by an untamed, desolate wilderness that could not care less whether he existed or not. The 17th of October, 1938, began indistinguishably from any other. Ozas set out at daybreak, shouldering a battered vintage rifle, a water canteen, a meager rucksack containing a pathetic lunch of cornbread wrapped in wax paper by his wife, and a tightly coiled length of thick rope he had never once parted with since using it to fish a corpse out of the gorge in 1933. His journal explicitly states that, on that particular day, Ozas harbored absolutely no intention of staying the night. His shift was scheduled to conclude at the northern shelter just as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. But as he passed by the cabin at approximately 3 in the afternoon, an atmosphere so dense, so palpably frigid, slithered down his spine that his footsteps ground to an abrupt halt. In his diary, Ozas utilized this exact haunting phrase, "I had a feeling that I should stop." The barometric pressure within the cradle that afternoon was suffocatingly bizarre. It was not the tranquil, serene silence of a woodland sanctuary. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of an impending implosion. Ozas pushed open the heavy, groaning wooden door and stepped into the gloom of the cabin. He unshouldered his rucksack, tossing it onto the coarse wooden table, and collapsed in utter exhaustion onto the rusted, screeching springs of the cot. He stripped off his mud-caked boots, using his rough, abrasive hands to knead his swollen, agonizingly sore feet. Dozens of minutes bled away, and he did absolutely nothing. He lit no fire. He retrieved no rations. He merely sat there, catatonic, as the encroaching darkness slowly dyed the room pitch black, his gaze pinned immovably to the western wall, where the lantern hung lifeless on its steel hook, listening to the wind violently clawing its way through the barren, skeletal trees. And then, piercing through that macabre, howling wind, another sound manifested. From the murky void just beyond the window, not terribly far away, came the sound of whistling. The rhythm was excruciatingly slow, melodic, unmistakably clear. The blood in Ozas's veins instantly turned to slush. Amidst thousands of acres of virgin, uninhabited primeval forest, the acoustic anomaly of a human being whistling brought forth an overwhelming sensation of wrongness, a distortion so profound it induced physical nausea. Yet the true mind-shattering horror lay not in the mere existence of the sound, but in its specific melody. It was an antiquated hymn, a lullaby his mother used to hum over his crib when he was a frail, sickly infant. That melody had absolutely no business existing within this fog-drenched wilderness. Not a single hiker, poacher, or lumberjack he had encountered in his 9 years of service could have possibly known it. That tune belonged to a parlor reeking of melted candle wax in a coal mining town deep in Pennsylvania, situated 300 miles to the north, a place he had vehemently severed all ties with, refusing to set foot there for the past 16 years. Ozas sat rigid, petrified on the bed. The whistling persisted, leisurely and unhurried. It began to move. He could vividly hear the heavy, deliberate crunch of footwear bearing down on the desiccated leaves, agonizingly slow and brimming with absolute certainty. It traveled from the direction of the creek, circled the rear of the cabin, dragged itself along the wooden lateral siding, and finally came to a dead halt right before the front porch steps. The whistling ceased. The surrounding space plunged into a lethal, suffocating silence, as if the entire forest were collectively holding its breath in sheer anticipation. Knock, knock, knock. 3 strikes upon the door echoed through the room, not frantic, not rushed. It was the deliberate knocking of an entity that knew, with absolute certainty, it held total control. A knock intended to announce an arrival, not to beg permission for entry. The distance between that thin wooden barrier and Oz's right shoulder was barely 4 paces. Page 17 of the journal confesses that Oz's did not move a single muscle. Not out of any well of bravery, but because his own biology had violently mutinied against him. The very muscles that had once hauled dead weight were now shackled by a primal, crippling cowardice. His hand, resting upon his right knee, was locked in rigor mortis, entirely incapable of curling into a fist. He could acutely feel his ribcage heaving with violent, erratic breaths, his heart executing frenzied, acrobatic leaps against his sternum, but the rest of his corporeal form had completely flatlined. Then, the knocking resounded once more. Knock, 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 and a voice spoke from the other side of that flimsy wooden door. "Oz's, it's getting dark out here." Oz's scalp prickled with a million icy needles. The breath lodged like a stone in his throat. The voice had called him by his exact name. But the most horrifying revelation, the one that caused the 37-year-old man's pupils to contract into pinpricks of sheer madness, was its specific timbre. The deep, warm resonance, tinged with the distinct exhaustion of a man who had just concluded an agonizingly long shift at the rail yard. It was the voice of his father. A man who had been dead for exactly 16 years. According to the official records, Oz's father had passed away in the autumn of 1922 in a suburban outpost of Scranton, Pennsylvania, collapsing from a sudden, massive coronary right at the dining table, face first into a plate of roast beef and potatoes. He had been laid to rest in a damp, decaying churchyard cemetery, a grave Oz's had just visited, standing silently before the headstone just the previous April. The voice of his father was an auditory memory he had been deprived of for a decade and a half. Yet it was seared so deeply into his subconscious, as intimately familiar and unmistakable as his own name. "Open up, son," the voice from the porch spoke again, its warmth inducing a violent shudder. "I've come a long way." Oz squeezed his eyes shut. A sickening cocktail of tears and cold sweat seeped from the corners of his eyelids. A barbaric psychological war was waging inside his skull. The buried instinct of an orphaned child shrieked at him to lunge forward, throw back the deadbolt, and hurl himself into those long-lost comforting arms. But the icy, calculated rationale of a survivalist ruthlessly crushed that impulse. Dead men do not walk, dead men do not whistle. Summoning the absolute last dregs of his breath, he whispered into the cabin's dense, mold-choked air, "My father is dead." The space beyond the door instantly plummeted into a sepulchral silence. The quiet stretched for a grueling 10 seconds, an oppressive weight bearing down on every pore of his skin. Then that resonated one final time, devoid of rage, devoid of screaming, just a bone-weary, monotonous cadence penetrating the rotting timber. "I know I am, son. Open the door." No one knows exactly what triggered Oz's sudden burst of momentum in that paralyzing moment. He wrote that he had no conscious memory of how he physically maneuvered himself. His next cognitive realization was the image of himself prostrated on the filthy floorboards, eyes still clamped shut, slithering like some wretched, lowly vermin from the edge of the cot to the darkest, most forsaken corner of the room, where a trapdoor led down to the cramped, moisture-rotted crawl space beneath the cabin. He pried open the hatch, wriggled down into the freezing earth, clamped both hands around the rim of the door, and curled into a tight, fetal ball. Oz's remained beneath the floorboards for the entirety of that night. His stomach pressed flat against the foul, mud-stinking dirt, his eyes widened staring into an abyss of absolute nothingness. He did not hear the whistling again. There were no more knocks, no more beckoning pleas. Instead, he heard footsteps. Twice, the distinct, unhurried thud of heavy boots pacing directly above his skull. Walking from the front threshold to the stove, lingering in a dead standstill, and then ambling back. Once he heard the agonizing squeal of the bed springs, mirroring the precise acoustic strain of a grown man's physical weight settling onto the mattress. And most horrifying of all, A whisper calling his name slithered through the dark night, emanating from just an inch above the floorboards, uttered in a tone that no longer bothered to masquerade as the voice of his father. A wet, guttural, phlegm-choked rasp. Yet the element that haunted Ozas the most that night, the phenomenon he labeled the absolute worst part, was the forest itself. The Appalachian wilderness is never by nature a silent entity. It is perpetually alive with the chaotic symphony of deer trampling through brush, nocturnal owls hunting their prey, or the sharp, violent snapping of dead branches in the gale. But on the night of October 17, 1938, the entirety of those 14 miles of deep woods fell dead silent. It was not a serene, pastoral tranquility. It was an aggressive suppression, a forcibly restrained quietude, akin to the breathless atmosphere of a crowded auditorium where everyone holds their breath in synchronized dread, waiting for something terrible to drop. The forest, as Ozas penned, was listening right alongside him. When the sickly gray, diseased light of dawn finally managed to pry its way through the cracks, Ozas dared to push the hatch open and crawl back up. His anatomy was locked in a state of severe rigor. His teeth throbbed in agonizing pain from having been mercilessly ground together for hours on end. The cabin was utterly deserted. There were no muddy footprints desecrating the floor. There was no foul stench of decay lingering in the air. The rifle remained obediently on the bed. The hurricane lantern still hung from its hook, and his coat and hat remained draped over their pegs. The heavy wooden door was still shut tight, the deadbolt securely fastened from the inside, exactly as he had left it the afternoon prior. Everything was horrifyingly, maddeningly normal, save for a single anomalous object resting blatantly on the wooden table right beside his rucksack. It was a small, metallic artifact. Ozas's trembling hand reached out to grasp it. The glacial sting of brass made contact with his flesh. It was a coat button, roughly the size of a nickel. The surface of the brass was severely tarnished and oxidized into a dismal gray. On its reverse side, the metal shank had been violently bent back upon itself, an unmistakable wound left behind when a button is brutally, frantically ripped from the heavy fabric of a coat in a manic struggle. Ozas flipped the button over, squinting at the faint, obscured insignia stamped into its face, and his respiratory system suffered a catastrophic failure. It was a button from a railway worker's uniform coat. The one and only coat his father had ever worn with immense pride. The exact coat the family had manually dressed upon the old man's stiffening, rigor mortis-stricken corpse, burying it 6 feet beneath the soil in a Pennsylvania churchyard some 16 years ago. That very morning, Ozas shoved the brass button deep into his trouser pocket, snatched up his belongings, bolted from the cabin, and ran a grueling 7 miles straight down to the asphalt road. He slammed his letter of resignation onto the desk of a bewildered supervisor who was still chewing his breakfast, gunned the engine of his truck, and drove across 3 distinct county lines without so much as a single backward glance. That is the narrative Ozas committed to paper, a flawless, localized legend regarding a vengeful spirit returning to visit its offspring amidst a toxic, cursed wilderness, a tragic opera of supernatural mockery. For 80 years, backpackers have whispered this very tale around dying campfires, shivering at the mere thought of a phantom knock in the dead of night. But a legend, no matter how profoundly terrifying, perpetually omits the trivial yet unimaginably blood-soaked details. That 41-page diary performed its role as an obscuring mask to sheer perfection. It successfully deceived us all, painting a portrait of a pitiful man who fell victim to a paradox of time and space. The only caveat is Ozas forgot one fatal flaw, a catastrophic crack in logic that shatters his victim complex into a million jagged pieces. He explicitly claimed his father died of a sudden heart attack at the dinner table in Pennsylvania in the autumn of 1922. Yet, if you possess the morbid patience to dig through the ink-smudged, archival records of the rescue squads and the regional meteorological data of the Appalachian Mountains for that specific year, you will discover that the autumn of 1920 hosted no peaceful family dinners whatsoever. In November of that year, Pennsylvania was besieged by one of the most catastrophic blizzards in recorded history, and the official ledgers state it with glaring clarity. Ozas Thorncastle and his father were trapped deep in the hunting woods for an entire week, entirely devoid of rations. And only Ozas walked out of that whiteout land alive. and perfectly healthy. The question that inevitably arises is this: if the father truly perished from a weak heart, then what exactly did Oza violently rip that coat button from in order to forge a dark pact to secure his own miserable survival amidst the lunatic starvation of that frozen forest? And was the phantom lingering outside his door in 1938 truly the antagonist of this story? Or was it merely a creditor crossing the veil of mortality to reclaim what was savagely stolen? The truth, much like the roots of an ancient tree, always emits a distinct odor meant to conceal itself beneath the loamy soil. It does not smell like the faded watery ink or the mildewed, yellowing parchment of Oza's journal, nor does it carry the putrid, rotting stench of a decomposing feral beast. The absolute truth of the autumn of 1922 smells exactly like the rusted metal tang of frozen blood, combined with the razor-sharp, clinical scent of ozone whipping directly into your nasal cavity moments before a blizzard descends to bury all sins. Tear out the 5th page of that diary immediately, the page where Oza's meticulously, beautifully lied about a warm, intimate evening gathered in their Pennsylvania home, about a gentle heart attack, gracefully claiming the life of a beloved patriarch amidst the mouth-watering aroma of roasted meat and mashed potatoes. It is a cheap, pathetic illusion, a psychological defense mechanism Oza's plastered over his own conscience for 14 agonizing years. The county rescue station's archives do not possess the capacity to lie. The terse, arid lines, clattered out on a mechanical typewriter and submitted to the authorities that year, document a reality infinitely more barbaric. In November 1922, the Appalachian Range buckled under the weight of the worst blizzard of the decade. The snow did not fall in soft, poetic flakes. It rained down like shards of sub-zero glass, crushing the skeletal pines beneath its mass. The temperature plummeted to depths capable of freezing the mercury solid within a thermometer. And it was right in the middle of that blinding, white-hot hellscape that Oza and his father had decided to go hunting. They became trapped, no hearth to warm them, no mashed potatoes to comfort them, only fingers turning a necrotic black, and an empty, hollowed-out stomach that had begun to cannibalize its own mucosal lining. Have you ever experienced a degree of starvation and frostbite so absolute that the boundary separating human morality from pure animalistic survivalism is completely obliterated? The high-altitude cold does not grant you a swift execution. It flays you alive from the inside out. It infiltrates your respiratory tract, transforming every intake of breath into thousands of microscopic needles puncturing your failing lungs. It thickens the blood in your veins, turning it into a sluggish, black, tar-like sludge. In that suffocating, blindingly white void so claustrophobic you cannot even see your own hands in front of your face, the Appalachian forest is not merely a passive, unfeeling backdrop of nature. It is a living, breathing entity. The indigenous populations who have eked out a meager existence at the foot of these mountains for centuries have passed down an immortal, unforgiving law of the deep woods. The forest never saves the weak free of charge. When you collapse into the snowbanks, when your heart stammers out its final, exhausted beats on death's doorstep, the primordial darkness of the wilderness will extend its invisible, glacial fingers and place a contract right before your eyes. A dark, unspoken pact, yet one that is horrifically crystal clear. The absolute price to keep the flame of life burning within your own chest must always, without fail, be paid by extinguishing the flame of the one traveling beside you. Life is not conjured from the void. It is merely profanely transferred from one vessel to another. The father did not die of a gentle heart attack. When the rescue teams finally exhumed his corpse from beneath the dense permafrost several months later, they noted a gruesome detail the family subsequently paid exorbitant bribes to cover up. The corpse's ribcage had been violently crushed, the splintered bone puncturing the lungs, and the expression frozen upon that dead face was one of absolute, unadulterated terror. Those were not injuries inflicted by an avalanche, nor were they the work of a marauding grizzly. They were the undeniable remnants of a physical struggle. A bloody, desperate wrestling match executed right upon the icy ground between a father and son, when sheer panic and the instinct of a cornered beast drove Oza to completely shed the skin of his humanity. Close your eyes and visualize that exact moment. The wind is screaming in agonizing wails, sounding like a chorus of 10,000 weeping demons. The frail elderly father collapses, his lips a cyanotic purple, weakly extending a trembling hand, desperately pleading for salvation from his strapping, able-bodied son. But Oses does not bend down to hoist him onto his back. Oses stands there, staring down at the man who gave him life, and he can palpably feel the ravenous, predatory gaze of the forest burst into the back of his neck. The fog coils around his ankles, like a beast preparing to strike. The forest demands a sacrifice, and caught between his own continued existence and the life of his father, that pathetic coward of a man chose himself. No one, save for Oses and those barren, skeletal trees, knows the exact mechanics of what he did in that whiteout. Perhaps he lunged forward in a maniacal frenzy, utilizing the very calloused hands meant for savings to cave in the old man's chest, ruthlessly squeezing out the final, fragile remnants of bodily warmth. Or perhaps he simply took a calculated step backward, crossing his arms and watching impassively, allowing the dark, unseen entity of the storm to step forward and crush his father under the sheer weight of the cold, while he gritted his teeth, trembling, and accepted the compromise. Whichever method he employed, it was an act of cold-blooded murder, a sadistic sacrificial ritual, and in the absolute climax of that life-and-death struggle, Oses's sinewy fingers clamped down viciously onto the heavy fabric of his father's railroad coat and yanked with everything he had. The sharp, dry tier of thick canvas echoed sharply. A brass button shivered, its metal shank bent backward from the sheer brutal torque, dropping heavily into the cold, sweat-drenched palm of the treacherous son. It was not a freak accident, and it most certainly was not a sentimental keepsake. That freezing brass button was the token. It was the wet, bloody, red wax seal violently stamped onto the demonic contract between Oses Thorncastle and the Appalachian devil. Hand over the soul of your own flesh and blood, and I will carve a path for you to drag your miserable carcass out of this frozen valley. Now, possessing this putrid, unvarnished truth, take this bloody reality and transport it back to that crooked, leaning wooden cabin on the night of October 17, 1938. You will watch the geometry of everything twist and warp. The suffocatingly tense atmosphere, the sluggish whistling of the hymn, the crunching footsteps on the dry leaves outside the porch. None of it was a cheap jump scare orchestrated by a woodland demon seeking sadistic amusement. The entity standing outside the door calling out, "Oses, it's getting dark out here," was not some nameless, malicious monster draping itself in the stolen visage of the father to trick the ranger. No, it was the father. It was the soul of a man carrying a grudge capable of piercing the heavens, dragging the eternal, biting frost of the 1922 blizzard with him, clawing his way through the filthy, diseased cemetery dirt of Scranton to drag himself up from hell. That methodical, patient knock, knock, knock on the door did not herald a random catastrophe. It was the knock of a creditor arriving to aggressively collect the debt he was owed. "Open the door, son, I've come a long way." Yes, an agonizingly long way. 16 years traversing the realm of the dead, bearing a shattered ribcage and breath reeking of ice, solely to track down the son who sold him out to the devil. This revelation casts a razor-sharp, merciless spotlight on Oses's pathetic actions that night. The fact that he curled into a ball, scurrying like an insect to hide in the dark, rank, root-choked crawl space beneath the floorboards, did not stem from standard supernatural dread. He was not afraid of ghosts. He was terrified of his own monstrous sin, the absolute, bottomless depravity of a murderer who knows deep in his marrow that he deserves to be torn limb from limb had paralyzed his every muscle. Beneath the freezing floorboards, Oses bit his own tongue until it bled, suffocating his own breathing in the claustrophobic air. The acidic stench of urine, mixed with the bitter tang of his own terror sweet, radiated from his body. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to shrink his very existence into nothingness, listening to those heavy, deliberate footsteps hammering on the planks right above his head. Every footfall from that vengeful spirit slammed into his eardrums like the Grim Reaper's sledgehammer, driving nails into his coffin. And when the diseased, gray light of morning finally bled into the room, the brass button sitting brazenly on the wooden table was not some parlor trick of dark magic. It was an invoice. A cold, direct memorandum from the ancient forest, throwing the very blood-soaked collateral he had offered right back into his face to deliver a clear message. "We have not forgotten. The contract remains active. You can run, but blood must be paid with blood. Ozas chose to run. He snatched up the button as if touching a red-hot coal, discarded his badge, abandoned his ranger's coat, threw himself into his pickup truck, and stomped the accelerator to the floor in a manic frenzy, tearing through the dense fog of the Pisgah Valley. The roaring engine spewed a thick cloud of gray exhaust, carrying away a man utterly convinced he had just successfully outsmarted destiny, slipping through the narrowest crack in death's door. He naively believed that if he merely left the forest in his rearview mirror, if he buried that cursed button deep in the pitch-black abyss of a wooden box, 3 whole county lines away from the Appalachian cradle, his karmic retribution would never be able to track him down. Ozas relocated to Asheville. He rented a home built with fortified brick walls, establishing his own personal stronghold. Every time night fell, he personally inspected every single deadbolt on the front doors, locking down every window, big or small. He pulled the heavy blankets completely over his head, deluding himself into believing that these crude bricks and the hundreds of miles of highway acted as an impenetrable shield, isolating him from any vengeful entity. He hoarded that tarnished button not out of any sense of nostalgia, but the way a guilty man clings to the murder weapon. A filthy talisman, he believed, would hide his scent from the devil as long as it remained concealed. But alas, the supreme crowning idiocy of a perpetrator always lies in their delusional belief that they are the one holding the reins. Ozas exhausted every single neuron he possessed standing guard against a home invasion from the outside world. He flinched violently at the sound of the wind whistling through the window frames, hyper-analyzing the contorted shadows of the trees, stretching across the wet asphalt beneath the street lamps, shuddering uncontrollably whenever a faint whiff of burning wood drifted through the air. He locked the external world out, obsessively keeping his eyes glued to the distant darkness, completely oblivious to the brutal, suffocating truth that was already tightening the noose around his neck. The oppressive atmosphere of that snowy valley in 1922, the foul, metallic stench of ultimate betrayal, had never actually been left behind in the ranger's cabin. It had latched onto him. It slithered deep into his lungs, saturating his capillaries and flesh, and casually strolled right through the front door of that rented house in Asheville. He had no concept that solid brick walls offered absolutely no defense against the cruelest punishment of all. Because the true enemy, the entity coldly clutching his death warrant, was not some ragged phantom crawling out of a grave to wander the dense woods. That entity had no need to violently smash through a glass window to demand entry. That entity had no need to stand in the yard whistling hymns to summon the dead. That entity was already inside the house. That entity shared a bed with him every single night. That entity smiled tenderly at him every morning, ironing his collared shirts with a meticulous, terrifying perfection. And that entity was standing calmly in the warm, spice-scented kitchen, carefully grinding a pinch of a dark gray root into an ultra-fine powder, slowly stirring that lethal toxin into a bowl of steaming, boiling broth, her eyes completely serene as she waited for the heavy sound of his footsteps to echo down the staircase. The ancient forest always finds a way to collect its debts, but sometimes it delegates the privilege of execution to another pair of hands. A pair of patient, vicious hands that never, ever tremble. The hands of the woman he so affectionately referred to as his wife, Marigold, a name that sounds like a sun-drenched flower radiating morning warmth. In the frantic, trembling memoirs of Ozas Thorncastle, her portrait emerges as an invisible saint, a woman molded from absolute endurance and unyielding devotion. Ozas wrote of his wife with a sickening blend of gratitude and the smug complacency of a patriarchal fool, a kind, patient woman, and one who knew what not to ask. But oh, Ozas, you were so catastrophically wrong. She never raised her voice to interrogate him, not because she was a submissive, cowardly pushover, nor out of the blind obedience of a dutiful wife. She remained silent because she had known absolutely everything from the very first second. To comprehend the deadly, lethal nature of that silence, we must swim upstream against the current of the past, navigating through the fog-choked ravines to penetrate deep into the territory the Appalachian locals refer to as the Blind Country. These are valleys so agonizingly narrow that the sunlight only dares to lick tips of the pine trees on the highest ridges for a mere few hours a day, entirely abandoning the valley floor to drown in a damp, mildewed darkness reeking of rotting sawdust and freezing mud. Marigold was birthed directly from that suffocating darkness. She was no ordinary provincial girl, the blood-dark, toot inheritance of the granny women, the root doctor, the folk witches of the blind valleys, women who never once read a book but possessed an encyclopedic, terrifying knowledge of every leaf vein, every tangled root system buried deep within the black earth. They did not don black cloaks, nor did they take flight upon broomsticks. They were women possessing heavily calloused hands, their fingernails perpetually crusted with tree sap and gritty soil. They possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of exactly which desiccated, pulverized mushrooms could soothe the ravages of a brutal consumption, and they knew intimately which specific taproots, when simmered over a low flame for 3 hours, would yield a perfectly translucent liquid, capable of reducing a robust, healthy liver into a putrefying puddle of helpful sludge within a decade's time. Marigold came of age amidst bundles of dried herbs dangling inverted from the exposed rafters, inhaling the acrid, pungent aroma of wild weeds roasting over hot coals, and learning to listen to the merciless, rhythmic pulse of the natural world. And the individual who dragged that frail, ragged little girl named Marigold out from the suffocating depths of that impoverished valley was none other than Ozaz's father. The old man was not merely her father-in-law, he was her savior, her benefactor, the solitary soul who had ever extended a warm hand redolent with the scent of pipe tobacco and raw sawdust to take her in. In Marigold's mind, the memory of the old man was inextricably bound to that thick, heavy canvas railway uniform coat, where those brilliantly polished brass buttons would brush against her cheek whenever he enveloped her in a protective embrace, shielding her from the flesh-rending, bone-chilling bite of the winter frost. The affection Marigold harbored for that man was infinitely more profound and sacred than any organized religion. Therefore, I ask you to vividly conjure that exact moment in November of 1922. As the raging fury of the blizzard finally subsided, the heavy wooden door of their home burst open, carrying a glacial blast of wind that whipped directly into the burning hearth. Ozaz staggered across the threshold. He collapsed, sprawling face down upon the floorboards, his entire anatomy convulsing with violent tremors, his badly chapped lips weeping fresh blood. He wept, he shrieked, and he stammered out a disjointed tale of a sudden, merciless heart attack that had supposedly stolen his father away amidst the blinding white wilderness. Any ordinary woman would have crumbled beneath the agonizing weight of such devastating tidings. But Marigold did not. As she knelt beside him, peeling away the frozen, stiffened layers of her husband's coat, heavily encrusted with clotted snow, and bespricked his violently twitching form, the latent sixth sense of a blind valley witch instantly triggered a blaring alarm in her mind. She smelled it, lying dormant beneath the sour fermented reek of stale sweat and the acrid stench of cold-burned wool. There was a foul, nauseatingly metallic odor of absolute betrayal. It was the distinct pheromone of primal terror, the precise scent secreted only from the sweat glands of those who have just violently extinguished the life of their own kind. And then, as she carried Ozaz's sodden heap of garments to be laundered in a basin of frigid, biting water, her numb, freezing fingers grazed a rigid, unyielding object buried deep within the tattered lining at the very bottom of his trouser pocket. She pulled it free from the fabric. A brass button, roughly the size of a coin, its surface heavily oxidized and tarnished. On its reverse, the metal shank had been folded back upon itself with a sickening, violent force, leaving it pathetically mangled. Marigold's hand froze dead in the icy water. The atmosphere within the washroom was instantly vacuumed of all oxygen, leaving only the sharp, fracturing sounds of ice accumulating against the window panes. She recognized that button the very second her eyes fell upon it. For as long as she drew breath, she would never mistake that faint, embossed insignia. It belonged to the uniform coat of the man who had saved her life. A man succumbing to a sudden coronary failure and collapsing into the snow would never under any circumstances possess the capacity to tear a button from his own chest with a force immense enough to warp a solid steel core. only a savage, desperate struggle, only a bloody, violent wrestling match to the death could have forged such a brutal, traumatic scar. In the precise fraction of a second that her thumb traced the freezing brass surface, Marigold saw through the entirety of the theatrical charade. The man currently lying in bed, groaning in feigned agony, was no devoted son grieving the loss of his patriarch. He was a cowardly, sniveling monster who had offered up his own father as a sacrificial lamb to the devil in exchange for a pathetic sliver of survival. She did not scream. She did not seize a butcher's knife and charge into the bedroom to swiftly execute the murderer. The absolute stillness radiating from Marigold in that moment was as cruel and bottomless as an abyssal trench of ice. She gently, methodically scrubbed the filth and mud from his garments, hung them with meticulous care upon the drying line, and then quietly returned the brass button to its exact place of origin within his pocket. Her countenance remained an impenetrable mask of serene, gentle devotion, not betraying even the slightest ripple of boiling wrath. Yet deep within the dark confines of that woman's ribcage, a 14-year-long death sentence had just been silently, irrevocably sealed. For 14 agonizing years thereafter, Ozas remained utterly convinced that he was incubating a demonic affliction, a malignant curse born from the shadows of the ancient forest that was slowly eroding his physical vessel from the inside out. The physicians in Brevard, upon examining him in the bitter winter of 1946, shook their heads in sheer desperation at a stomach wholly incapable of tolerating sustenance and a horrifying degree of emaciation that left his skin as thin, jaundiced, and brittle as antique parchment. They diagnosed it as a baffling, unprecedented medical mystery. The journal categorized it as karmic retribution, but the waking reality assumed a form infinitely more pragmatic and blood-soaked. This was no pathological anomaly. This was the macabre botany of the Grim Reaper. Step into Marigold's kitchen. Feel the stifling, oppressive heat radiating from the cast-iron stove, its coals glowing a vicious, angry red. Atop a low simmering flame, a pot of bone broth was perpetually boiling, emitting the rich, fatty, mouth-watering aroma of beef marrow and caramelized charred onions. But resting just adjacent to it, cleverly concealed behind a dingy flour canister, sat tiny dark-tinted glass vials containing a fine ash-colored powder. It was an ultra-concentrated extraction derived from wolfsbane roots, harvested from the most treacherous, vertical mountain slopes, intimately blended with the pulverized shavings of severely dehydrated death-cap mushrooms. Every single morning, every single evening, relentlessly for thousands of consecutive days, Marigold utilized a tiny horn spoon, carefully tapping it exactly 3 times against the rim of the bowl, dusting those invisible particles of death into her husband's steaming soup. The sound of the wooden ladle stirring the mixture against the edges of the ceramic pot produced a muted, rhythmic scraping, a low, haunting lullaby sung by the angel of death. The boiling temperature of the bone broth would instantly dissolve the powder, while the pungent, bitter tang of the lethal toxins was flawlessly masked by the robust, overpowering flavors of black pepper and rosemary. She would carry the bowl directly to Ozas's bedside. Her visage was the picture of benevolence, her eyes overflowing with the tender, heartbreaking sorrow of a devoted wife. He would accept the soup with violently trembling hands, thick, protruding blue veins webbing across the backs of his emaciated flesh. He would raise it to his cracked lips and take deep, desperate swallows. The very second that viscous, scalding liquid slid down his esophagus, it left a trail of searing, blistering heat in its wake, akin to swallowing liquid fire. Then the agonizing contractions would commence. Ozas's stomach would violently churn and rebel, fighting a desperately losing battle against the devastation wrought by the microscopic toxic crystals corroding his mucosal lining. He would break out in a cold, clammy sweat, his forehead drenched, collapsing back onto the mattress with pitiful groans, his wheezing breaths exhaling the sour putrid stench of regurgitated gastric acid. The absolute zenith of this physical deterioration arrived one winter evening. The journal chronicled that he had lost so much mass that while lifting his bowl of broth, the gold wedding band slipped right off his skeletal ring finger. The sharp, metallic clink of the ring, striking the bottom of the porcelain bowl, echoed with a blinding, razor-sharp clarity, violently tearing through the suffocating, silent atmosphere of the bedroom. It lay motionless at the bottom of the vessel, gleaming and flashing amidst that dark brown lethal liquid. Ozas stared vacantly at it, tears pooling in his sunken eyes, consumed by self-pity for his own tragic, miserable fate. And Marigold stood right there beside him, holding a warm cloth to dab the cold, sickly sweat from his brow. The soothing scent of lavender wafting from the fabric intermingled with the foul odor of rotting disease, concocting an atmosphere so claustrophobic it induced nausea. She looked down at the ring, resting at the bottom of the broth, then shifted her gaze to the deep-sunken, panic-stricken eyes of the murderer, the corners of her lips curling upward into an impossibly thin, unbreakable, razor-sharp smile. She possessed no desire for him to die a swift death. A quick thrust of a blade or a massive immediate dose of arsenic, sufficient to end him in a single night, would have been an act of profound mercy. She wanted him to intimately taste his own decay. She wanted him to bear witness to his own body rotting away day by day, all while his mind remained hyper-lucid, left with nothing but his own escalating terror to gnaw upon. Marigold's psychological torture was an absolute masterpiece of manipulative artistry. She allowed Ozas to construct his own horrifying phantasmagoric scenarios within his mind. Every night, when Ozas jerked awake from his nightmares, screaming in sheer terror about the whistling, the knocking on the door, the phantom of his father lurking out in the deep woods, Marigold would always embrace him. She would stroke his sweat-matted, greasy hair, whispering in a voice as soft and smooth as velvet, "It is all right, my love. It is merely a nightmare. The doors are locked tight. Nothing from the outside can ever harm us." And she was entirely correct. Nothing from the outside was harming him, because the most terrifying monster imaginable was already wrapping its arms tightly around him, imprisoning him within a penitentiary forged of absolute care and nurturing. The ultimate cruelty does not lie in stabbing a victim in the back, but in forcing the victim to weep tears of profound gratitude, to live entirely dependent upon, and to draw their final, agonizing breaths leaning against the very hands that are patiently, methodically strangling the life out of them every single day. The plush, comfortable bed, reeking of medicinal ointments and freshly laundered sheets, had become an inescapable tomb. The entire volume of the room was saturated with the stifling, oppressive heat of the thick woolen blankets, Marigold meticulously draped over him, crushing the life from his slowly withering lungs. Ozas had been successfully incarcerated within the very fortress he had constructed to flee his own past. The dry, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock synchronized seamlessly with his erratic, failing heartbeat, counting down every single drop of venom seeping into his bone marrow. And Marigold, the woman presumed blind to the tragedies of the world by every outside observer, was the only player in the room with her eyes wide open, seeing through the entirety of the game, silently, flawlessly positioning her chess pieces for one final devastating strike. And that fatal strike commenced with the forceful stripping away of the final, fragile barricade protecting the murderer's fragile psyche. During that barren, desolate winter of 1946, when the bone-chilling frost of the North Carolina hills amassed into thick, heavy layers of hoarfrost, clinging stubbornly to the window panes, the second-floor bedroom of the rented Asheville house had mutated into a suffocating purgatory. The air within was thick and viscous, saturated with the pungent scent of menthol rubs, the sour, acidic body odor of a man rotting alive, and the earthy, sickeningly sweet aroma of the root-infused soups Marigold brought him every passing day. Ozas lay there, as gaunt and emaciated as a dead, hollowed-out tree entirely drained of its sap, utterly swallowed by the terrifyingly vast expanse of the thick woolen blankets. The very night his wedding band slipped from his skeletal finger and plunged into the broth, an absolute, paralyzing dread took permanent root in his cerebral cortex. He could not sleep. The wind shrieking through the crevices of the roof tiles sounded exactly like the wailing of a trapped, damned soul, violently tearing at his auditory nerves. In the midst of that suffocating silence, Ozas tremblingly extended a spindly, frail arm covered in mottled liver spots out from beneath the edge of the covers. His palm, slick with a cold, sickly sweat, fumbled blindly in the pitch-black darkness, stretching toward the small wooden nightstand positioned flush against the head of the bed. The coarse, abrasive texture of the ancient varnish scraped against his fingertips. He hooked his thumb into the groove and, utilizing the last pathetic dregs of his fading strength, yanked the drawer open. A low, hollow scraping noise echoed through the room. He needed to touch that brass button. For 8 grueling years, that demonic artifact, violently ripped from his father's frozen corpse in that snowy valley, had served as his sole psychological life preserver. He was obsessively convinced that as long as he possessed the devil's seal, as long as he could rub his thumb over that cold, tarnished surface and its bent metal shank, the dark pact remained securely locked away. It was tangible proof that still maintained control over his own blood-soaked past. But on this night, Ozus's parched, bony fingers only grazed against bare, empty wood. There was no freezing touch of metal. There was no familiar embossed texture. There was absolutely nothing. Ozus's breath caught violently in his throat. The volume of air trapped within his lungs abruptly solidified into a block of jagged ice. He bolted upright, throwing his upper torso forward, entirely disregarding the agonizing, cramping spasms radiating from his ulcerated stomach. His deeply sunken eyes, webbed with blood-red capillaries, bulged wildly into the darkness. Both of his hands began to frantically, manically claw at the bottom of the drawer, tossing pods of old paper money, violently knocking away a box of matches, digging desperately into the farthest dust-choked corners. The sound of his fingernails gouging the wood shrieked through the air, shrill, piercing, and overwhelmingly desperate. The button was gone. Caught in the throes of a surging, paranoid delusion, his journal hastily recorded that it moved on its own. His fractured, splintering mind conjured a horrifying vision of a rotting, invisible hand from the underworld slipping through the cracks of reality, reaching into the drawer and reclaiming the collateral. But the truth always strangles a man with the cold, unyielding cruelty of the mundane world. There was no demonic hand. The only entity capable of gliding through this room like a phantom shadow, tidying the tabletop, smoothing the bedsheets, and silently slipping a hand into the drawer to pilfer Ozus's final ward, was the woman currently sleeping with perfectly measured breaths in the adjacent room. Marigold had stolen it. She knew the exact location of that button, just as intimately as she knew the precise dosage of toxin required to lace his meals every day. She stripped it away to deliver a catastrophic, system-crashing blow to the murderer's final psychological defense mechanism. And then the most sadistic game of cat and mouse commenced. 4 days. 4 days that stretched out like 4 eternities, plunging straight into the abyss. During those 4 days, the house in Asheville played host to a silent, wordless insanity. Ozus, a man who was actively dying from total organ failure, suddenly erupted with the frantic, desperate strength of a cornered wild beast. He flipped the heavy mattress, soaked with the foul sweat of his sickness. He hurled goose-feather pillows across the room, sending a blizzard of down fluttering through the air, catching the dancing dust motes in the sickly, gray winter light. He slithered on his belly across the floorboards, pressing his gaunt, skeletal cheek against the filth-caked crevices, utilizing a dull butter knife to pry up the floorboards with bleeding, shredded fingertips. The frantic clattering, the heavy, ragged, wheezing pants spewing the foul odor of acid reflux, completely saturated the room's atmosphere. He scrutinized every microscopic crack in the plaster, every loose fiber of the rug, muttering incoherent, nonsensical prayers. He was ostensibly searching for a tiny piece of brass, but in reality he was desperately attempting to stitch his own disintegrating mind back together. And amidst this tangled web of absolute chaos, Marigold stood as a perfectly sculpted monument to the tranquility of the abyss. She stood silently at the threshold, still clutching that immaculate white cloth, radiating the faint scent of lavender. The pallid light washed over a serene face devoid of a single ripple of emotion. When Ozus tilted his bloodshot, feral eyes up to look at his wife, begging, interrogating, screaming at her, demanding to know if she had accidentally put his keepsake away while cleaning, Marigold merely blinked with infinite gentleness. "No, I haven't seen it," she replied. Her tone was soothing, flawlessly flat, without single micro-tremor or second of hesitation, not one extraneous flutter of an eyelash. It was the most perfect lie ever uttered by a woman famously known as one who never told a lie. Marigold's denial carried a lethal, crushing weight. It flattened Ozus entirely. If his wife had not taken it, and if no thief had broken into the house, then only one logical explanation remained. The vengeful spirit from the deep woods had finally found him. The contract had been violently shredded. By the fourth day, Oza surrendered. The manic frenzy had wrung out his final microscopic drop of energy. He collapsed onto the ravaged floor, abandoning his failing vessel to the excruciating, tearing spasms of his stomach. He squeezed his eyes shut, counting every sluggish, lethargic footfall of the grim reaper drawing near. But Marigold would not permit him the luxury of such an easy demise. The execution had to be carried out with absolute, flawless precision. In the early hours of the 5th morning, when the darkness still blanketed the house like a thick vat of black tar, and all of creation was submerged in that horrifying dead silence just before dawn, the house was freezing. The temperature had plummeted so drastically that one's breath instantly crystallized into opaque plumes of smoke in the air. Ozas awoke. His throat was a barren desert, bitterly tasting of the coppery blood seeping from his necrotic gums. He could no longer tolerate coffee. The mere thought of that black sludge made him violently retch. He needed a sip of tea. He needed a frail, pathetic sliver of warmth to soothe his violently contracting stomach. Clutching the banister with skeletal fingers, Ozas dragged bare feet down the stairs to the ground floor. The agonizing creak of the ancient wooden steps groaning beneath the weight of his soulless corpse sounded exactly like bones snapping under pressure. The space was saturated with the smell of floor wax and the damp, musty odor rising from the old carpets. He staggered into the kitchen. Everything was drowned in a desolate, gray stillness. The black castern stove sat completely dormant in the corner, resembling a slumbering monstrosity. That massive block of metal radiated a sharp, piercing glacial chill, freezing the very air around it. Atop the stove, the silhouette of a tin tea kettle loomed, blurry and indistinct. Ozas painstakingly dragged his feet closer, extending a trembling hand to grasp the kettle's handle. And then his every movement froze. Sitting brazenly, dead center upon the perfectly round tin lid of the kettle was it, the brass button. Beneath the sickly, pallid light filtering through the fog-streaked window pane, the tarnished copper surface glinted with a profoundly malicious aura. Ozas's pupils dilated to their absolute limit. His chest seized, utterly incapable of drawing in another ounce of oxygen. For a fractured moment that stretched into eternity, he stood there, paralyzed, as the pitch-black darkness of sheer terror swallowed his pupils whole. It was here. The ward had not vanished into thin air. It had navigated its own way out of a second-story drawer, traversed the desolate, silent hallways, and brazenly displayed itself upon the lid of a kettle. Like a man thoroughly hypnotized by serpent's venom, Ozas slowly, mechanically extended his index finger and thumb to make contact with the edge of the button. And the tactile sensation that violently ricocheted up his nerve endings caused his brain to detonate. The button was burning hot. No, not merely warm. It was scalding, a searing, blistering heat that shot through his fragile skin, immediately raising an angry red welt as if the metal had just been plucked from boiling water. Ozas recoiled, violently snatching his hand back. On pure reflex, his palm slapped hard against the cast-iron surface of the stove beneath it, freezing. The black iron block was chilled to the bone, possessing the absolute biting frost of metal that had not seen a fire in hours, heat and ice. A burning hot button resting upon a stove, as frigid as a freshly dug grave. Within the psychological framework of a man plagued by hallucinations and driven to the brink by his own crushing guilt, this illogical, impossible contrast in temperature was the irrefutable, ironclad proof of a supernatural presence. The journal recorded that, the very instant he held that scalding button in his hand, Ozas thought with crystalline clarity of the hymn his mother used to whistle, of the 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the wooden cabin door in 1938. His mind completely and utterly collapsed. I do not think he ever left. I think he is still in the cabin, and I think sometimes he sends the button out to remind me. That was the desperate, pathetic confession he scrawled on the very last line of his 41 pages. In Ozas's eyes, the devil had marched right into his kitchen, breathing the fiery heat of hell directly onto the blood-stained token to signal the absolute end. But once again, to those of you listening out there, I urge you to step outside the panicked, delusional perspective of the murderer and look directly into the quietest, darkest corner of this house. There was no demon rising from the grave to heat a brass button. The truth, much like the pools of water stagnating on a wooden cutting board after a brutal slaughter, was cold, calculated, and ruthlessly deliberate. Approximately 1 hour before the agonizing creak of the staircase echoed through the house, in the blackest, most ungodly hour of the night, Marigold had awoken. She had never been fully asleep. She had silently descended into the kitchen on bare feet that produced not a single microscopic sound. She retrieved the button she had kept hidden for the past 4 days. With an eerie, spine-chilling composure, the woman lit a small taper candle, utilized a pair of iron coal tongs to grip the brass button tightly, and held it directly over the flickering, dancing flame. A faint, barely audible sizzle hissed into the air. The brass surface absorbed the intense thermal energy, darkening to a cruel, blackened hue. When it was sufficiently heated to guarantee a blistering burn on human flesh, Marigold carefully placed it dead center upon the tin lid of the tea kettle, resting on a stove that hadn't been lit in days. She blew out the candle, meticulously erasing every trace of life from the kitchen, and calmly returned to her bed, closing her eyes and waiting. The act of placing that button upon the kettle was no random coincidence. With the obscure folk remedies and dark, subterranean magical rites, folk magic, practiced by the Blind Valley witches of the Appalachians, boiling water is the ultimate symbol of wrath reaching its boiling point of long overdue debts demanding immediate settlement. Placing the collateral upon a hollow, freezing kettle delivered the most ruthless, unspoken message imaginable. Your contract has reached a boiling point. The price is due. The waiting ends here. As Ozas collapsed onto the freezing kitchen floor, clutching his emaciated chest, gasping for air with his mouth wide open like a fish stranded on dry land, weeping in sheer, unadulterated terror before the phantom of his father, he had absolutely no idea that the architect of this psychological inferno was lying peacefully on the second floor. Marigold lay there, perfectly measured breaths passing through her nostrils. In the pitch-black darkness, the corners of the lips of the woman, deemed blind to the ways of the world by every outsider, curled into a faint smirk, tasting the sweet, intoxicating nectar of a vengeance that had been fermenting for 14 agonizing years. Ozas's mind had officially died that early morning, long before his physical flesh truly began to rot. The game was halfway concluded. She only needed to wait for a window to be thrown wide open to welcome the west wind. 12 grueling, agonizing years dragging on since the night of the boiling kettle. The remaining Fluff's Thorncastle was nothing more than a hollow, decaying shell, precariously clinging to a mortal coil that had rejected him long ago. The autumn of 1958 crashed into Asheville, bringing with it razor-sharp winds that shaved the maple trees bare out on the streets, breathing a bone-chilling frost against the cracked, fractured window panes. The second-floor bedroom was now completely saturated with the nauseating, gag-inducing flavor of death. It was not the metallic tang of fresh blood, but rather the earthy, sour stench of muscle tissue, cannibalizing, decomposing with the reek of moth out, inextricably mingled with the reek of mothballs, cheap medicinal alcohol, and the pungent sting of ammonia rising from the soiled bedsheets that Ozas no longer possessed the strength to leave. His skin was tissue paper, thin, jaundiced, and deeply wrinkled, like a sheet of antique parchment stretched tight over a fiercely protruding, jagged rib cage. Every rattling breath that wheezed through his palate sounded gravelly and choked, akin to the dry, abrasive crunch of dead leaves being pulverized beneath a heavy boot. The Grim Reaper was already standing vigil at the foot of the bed, yet patiently awaiting a single silent nod of approval from the woman sitting utterly motionless in the velvet-upholstered armchair in the corner of the room. That morning the sky was clouded with a sickly, leaden gray. The primal intuition of a dying beast whose life force was utterly depleted warned Ozas that his final day had dawned. Summoning the absolute last, pathetic dregs of breath squeezed from his fibrous, ruined lungs, he weakly rasped his wife's name. As Marigold approached the bedside, carrying the faint scent of lavender and that gentle, counterfeit warmth that had successfully imprisoned him for 14 years, Ozas turned his clouded, rheumy eyes toward her, staring with pathetic supplication. He begged her to fetch the tiny wooden box hidden at the very bottom of the wardrobe. He desperately wanted to hold that brass button one final time. In the deepest, darkest trenches of paranoia and terror, he still harbored the incredibly naive belief that if he could just grip the ward tightly, if he could just clutch the devil's seal, his shattered soul might stand a microscopic chance of not being dragged down into the black, suffocating mud of hell. Marigold said absolutely nothing. She turned away in silence, lifting the dark wooden box from its hiding place. The rusted hinges let out a faint, agonizing squeal as the lid was pried open. Her soft, delicate fingers pinched the freezing, tarnished button, bringing it over and placing it gently into the gaunt, liver-spotted palm of her cowardly husband. Ozas instantly curled his fingers inward, clamping down on the piece of metal like a drowning man clutching at a fragile reed. He exhaled a low, groaning sigh, and his deeply sunken eye sockets fluttered shut. His heartbeat decelerated, surrendering his final, lingering shred of consciousness to a shallow, feverish, and shadow-drenched slumber. The 41-page journal, or more accurately, the elaborate web of lies fabricated by his surviving family in the aftermath, recounted a conclusion steeped in supernatural, hair-raising hues. They claimed that 2 hours after Marigold left the room and returned, she found the button had vanished from her husband's grasp. They claimed that the window, previously sealed shut, had inexplicably burst wide open. They claimed that a freezing west wind was howling into the room, carrying the distinct scent of burning wood smoke, and that the button was resting in dead silence upon the windowsill. While Ozas had drawn a masked final breath, his features locked of absolute, unadulterated terror. An invisible entity from the deep Pisgah woods had supposedly stepped inside, personally reclaiming its collateral and dragging his soul away. It is a spectacularly beautiful ghost story. But in the realm of waking reality, demons have no need to open windows with their own hands. The exact moment Ozas closed his eyes, Marigold had never taken a single step out of that room. She remained standing there, towering ominously by the edge of the mattress like a tombstone carved from solid granite. Her eyes, supposedly blind to the empathy and affairs of humanity, were now wide open, glacial, and pinned relentlessly to the chest that was heaving with the pathetic, fading rhythms of the man who had personally strangled the life from her greatest benefactor. She stood there with infinite patience amidst the dry, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock, listening as the gravelly rattle in his throat slowly transitioned into the wet, gurgling wheeze of fluid pooling in his lungs, the distinct biological marker that medical science refers to as the death rattle. His trachea was collapsing. This was the exact moment. Marigold leaned over him, devoid of a single ounce of pity, without the slightest microscopic tremor in her frame. She slipped her fingers, still stained with the sap of roots and lethal toxins, into Ozas's tightly clenched fist. His fingers were already beginning to stiffen into the rigid claws of pre-death convulsions. With cold mechanical force, Marigold pried his bony, freezing digits open, one by one. The friction between living flesh and dying flesh generated a coarse, sickeningly morbid sensation. Ozas let out a faint, muffled groan from deep within his throat, his eyelids fluttering erratically, yet utterly incapable of opening. He was stranded on the borderline between two realms, lacking the strength to hold on to anything in this world. The brass button dropped heavily into the palm of Marigold's hand. She gripped it tightly, turned her back on him, and walked deliberately toward the western wall. Her free hand seized the brass latch of the window. A sharp, dry clack snapped through the air. She violently shoved the wooden panes outward. Instantly, a razor-sharp gale from the Appalachian mountains, hundreds of miles away, shrieked into the room, violently shredding the stifling, antiseptic-soaked atmosphere. The wind thrashed the linen curtains, slamming them brutally against the plaster like thrashing, tormented phantoms. The wind carried a bone-deep, marrow-freezing chill, carrying the earthy, primal stench of rotting pine timber, and blasted directly into Ozas's nasal cavity. The acrid, searing scent of burning wood smoke lingering from a catastrophic blizzard in 1922. Marigold slowly, reverently placed the button down upon the splintered, cracked wooden windowsill. She did not place it there out of fear. She placed it there like a person who had just finalized a transaction, laying a blood-soaked receipt upon a merchant's counter. It was a wordless invitation, an invocation of passage executed by the hands of a blind valley witch. I have kept him here long enough. He is ruined. I have drained this husk of meat entirely dry. He belongs to you. Now you may come in and take him away. The ritual complete, Marigold stepped backward, retreating deep into the darkest, most shadowed corner of the room. She sat down in the armchair, silently folding her hands in her lap, her eyes wide open, completely submerging herself in the darkness. Upon the sweat-drenched mattress, Oz's Thorncastle violently snapped awake. His eyes rolled back into his skull, thick, blood-red capillaries bursting across the whites. His jaw clamped shut with such force that his teeth ground together in a horrific, ear-splitting shriek. He could feel it. The freezing mass of air, reeking of wood smoke, was pouring through the window, bringing with it the heavy, invisible crunch of boots dragging across the floorboards. The black shadow of the mountain, the spectral silhouette of a crushed, shattered rib cage, was advancing to the very edge of his bed. He flailed his empty, trembling hands desperately, frantically searching for the brass button, but the only thing his fingers could grasp was the crumpled, soiled bedsheets. He wanted to scream, he wanted to shriek his wife's name, but his throat had been violently clamped shut by an invisible hand, as cold as glacial ice. Marigold sat in the shadows, bearing witness to the absolute, unadulterated terror permanently carving itself into his features. She watched his body tense in one final, catastrophic spasm, arching his spine backward, exactly like a bow about to snap in half, before he abruptly collapsed, entirely limp and eternally still. A brutal, lonely, agonizing death, drowning in the torment of a debtor who could not beg for another single second of borrowed time. The woman exhaled a long, heavy sigh, shedding the suffocating burden of 14 grueling years. She slowly stood up and approached the windowsill. The west wind was still howling its fury outside. She picked up the brass button, the metal now feeling somehow colder, as if it had successfully fulfilled its dark, ordained purpose. Marigold pulled the window shut, locked the heavy latch, and permanently sealed the Appalachian forest on the outside. She carefully placed the button back into the depths of the small wooden box and secured the lid. Her task complete, with calm, measured steps as if nothing had ever transpired, the blind widow walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. She descended into the kitchen, brewed herself a steaming cup of chamomile tea, took a delicate sip, and smiled as she listened to the absolute, flawless silence enveloping the house. That 41-page journal was delivered to my doorstep in a chipped wooden box, carrying the naive, innocent hope of a niece who believed I would recount to the world a tale of a valley ghost, a tragic opera of supernatural woe that had accidentally befallen a dedicated, dutiful man. But when you use your fingernails to peel back the layers of fearful counterfeit prose penned by Oz's Thorncastle, what we find at the absolute bottom of the page is not an anomaly of the paranormal. What we find is the absolute pinnacle of human depravity. We, as frail and fragile creatures, always prefer to place the blame on the ancient woods. We prefer to huddle closely around campfires, taking a swig of beer and whispering to one another that out there, lurking in the mist, are wendigos, skinwalkers, or faceless phantoms waiting to devour us whole. We desperately cling to these demonic legends because doing so is infinitely easier than facing and admitting a truly nauseating truth, that the real devil, the most ruthless, bloodthirsty monster on this earth, is the man who would willingly crush his own father's ribcage just to steal one more breath of survival. The Appalachian forest did not kill Oz's Thorncastle. Those dense black pines did not personally execute him, nor did they ever bother to pass judgment upon him. That ancient wilderness merely tossed out a contract and then delegated the privilege of execution to another pair of hands. The most terrifying, most vicious punishment does not come from the claws or fang of a beast. It comes from the gentle, soft hands of the woman who patiently ironed your shirts, the woman who meticulously cooked your every dinner for 14 long, agonizing years. The deep woods merely provided Marigold with a reason, and she weaponized her entire youth to execute heaven's wrath, transforming her enemy's life into a bleeding slaughterhouse, dripping out drop by agonizing drop. Now, as the night has fully swallowed the place where you currently sit listening, I have a question for those of you who have remained lucid enough to linger until this final moment. I want you to close your eyes and place yourself in Marigold's shoes. If one day, while washing the laundry, you discovered that the person you share a bed with, the person you share the very air with every single night, was actually the monster who sold out the soul of your greatest benefactor just to save his own miserable life. what would you do? Would you panic and run to the police, allowing the law to settle it with a dry, sterile prison sentence? Or would you choose Marigold's path, remaining utterly silent, smiling with gentle devotion, locking him inside a 14-year marriage laced with slow poison, personally transforming his very existence into a living, inescapable hell on earth? Where exactly does your moral boundary lie? Leave your answer down in the comments. Do not lie to yourselves, because I will read every single one of them. Who knows, perhaps among you, there are a few who carry the blood of the blind country in your veins. And if you are an addict for the sensation of having your mind flayed open, if you delight in having the darkest, most depraved corners of humanity exposed while perfectly camouflaged beneath a mystical veneer like this, leave a like and subscribe so this mailbox can continue finding its way to you. But for now, turn off the lights, draw the curtains and lock your windows tight, because you never truly know what scent the west wind might blow into your home tonight. I will see you in the next case file.